And then Jesus spake unto his army of unicorns, saying, Many of you will die today, but that is necessary to defeat the Tyrannosaurus and save Germany. Then he did leap upon the back of his favorite unicorn, Nebuchadnezzar, and shouted, Eureka, which means kill the dinosaurs.
Excuse me.
I am right in the middle of a sermon here.
Yes, but you're mistaken.
Oh, did I get the plural of Tyrannosaurus wrong?
You got everything wrong. Unicorns, dinosaurs coexisting with Jesus, the word eureka. Everything you said is factually incorrect.
That's just like your opinion, man. I mean, you interpret the facts your way.
There's a difference between scientifically proven things and raw theory.
I suppose you're going to tell me that humans evolved over time from ape-like ancestors, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask you something. How come we still have gorillas and monkeys and chimps? I mean, how come they didn't evolve?
Well, off the top of my head, I don't really have a good answer, but I know there is one.
Yes, the Bible tells us in the book of Zither that God told some monkeys they had to stay back.
Okay, none of that is right.
God also said, some people will say this is wrong, but they are wicked and do bad things in their pants.
Hey!
Today on the show, are science and religion still in constant conflict? And now he pretends to be an anti-vaxxer just to date chicks with measles. Colin McEnroe.
Well, that's not true either. All right, yes, we are going to talk about the conflict, but sometimes the harmony. It's actually possible at times for there to be a harmony between faith and science. When you think about it, empiricism was sort of created, or not created. Empiricism was spearheaded by people like John Locke, who were deists, so it can be impossible. We'll talk about that dualism. We'll talk about how it plays out in various contexts. Our guests. Well, before I introduce our guests, let me tell a quick story, because we're going to talk about evolution first. So when my son was 4 years old, I dropped him off for the day with my parents, whom he called by their names, Bob and Barbara. So he got dropped off with Bob and Barbara, and he had a toy gorilla with him. And somebody mentioned, in a very sketchy way, the theory of evolution in connection with this gorilla. And so I left him there for the day, didn't know anything about what was going on. But my mother had some fairly peculiar ideas. And I never gave the gorilla or evolution a second thought until I was putting him to bed that night. And remember, he refers to his grandparents as Bob and Barbara, and he's 4 years old, and I'm putting him to bed, and suddenly out of nowhere, he looks at me and says, I come from monkeys, and Bob comes from monkeys, but Barbara doesn't come from monkeys. And I said, really? What does Barbara come from? And he said, pilgrims. And I was pretty aware that was a verbatim recitation of what my mother had told him. That would be pretty consistent with what my mother thought, which is, it's fine. You want to come from monkeys? That's fine. I don't come from monkeys. I'm from pilgrims. So people kind of cherry pick science and faith, maybe set it up the way they want to. As we go along today, we'll be talking to Connie Burtka, visiting professor for Wesley Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Human Origins Initiative for the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and Dr. Robert McCauley, professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture at Emory University, and the author of Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. But we're going to start with Jim Krupa, professor of biology at the University of Kentucky. His essay, Defending Darwin, appears in the March-April issue of Orion magazine, and is kind of what got Betsy Kaplan, our producer, heading down this particular path, exploring this particular question. So, Jim Krupa, set the stage for us. One of the things that this is about is the fact that you teach a course in biology for non-science majors, which you had some trepidation about teaching, and then read or remembered that E.O. Wilson said that this kind of course is the most important science course to teach. Why is that?
Well, it's hard to disagree with E.O. Wilson, but his point was an extremely valuable point, that these students are taking probably their last science class ever, and we really are doing a disservice to everyone if we send them out the door with a bad attitude towards science. And so Wilson felt that non-majors biology classes are teaching the future leaders of a state or a nation, depending on where, and that we really have an obligation to show them that science is interesting, biology is interesting, and that evolution is the foundation of biology. So once I heard Wilson talk about the importance of this class, I really felt that I needed to teach it.
Okay, so you just said evolution is the foundation of biology. One of the things that you point out, I find this fascinating, is that in a study of 34 developed countries, America is 33rd, one from the bottom, only ahead of Turkey, in the percentage of people who actually embrace evolution, or somewhere around 50% reject at least some aspect of evolution. So, but your way of dealing with this is rather than surreptitiously sliding evolution in here and there, pretty much from Jump Street, you are teaching evolution as the basis for biology, right?
Yep, and I think that's the way it needs to be done.
And so
I've had. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, it's interesting that after that Orion essay came out, I got a number of emails from folks telling me that I'm dead wrong on that, and that I'm confrontational, and I got called a number of names, but it really wrangled a number of folks that they feel that I'm dead wrong in starting off with evolution, and I simply disagree with them.
So what are the consequences for doing that? You start off with evolution and really kind of almost at every juncture, whether you're talking about differentiation of species or even how our bodies handle disease today. You're making evolutionary points. And then at the end of the semester, at the end of the teaching period, you do give a speech about, or a lecture about resistance to the notion of evolution. But what are the consequences of doing that with the student population that you have?
Well, I'll have a few more students walk out of my class or possibly drop my class, which is fine. The teaching evaluations will have more comments opposing the way I'm teaching, but that's part of the business. If I were teaching to win a popularity contest, I would teach it in a way that I would offend the fewest number of students. But if factual information is offensive, that's just the way we have to do it. So a little bit of a backlash from students on the way I teach.
Well, let me add a few other voices to this conversation. So Connie Burtka, he says that this is the best way to do it. Is there a different way to do it? In other words, if we have this dualism, if we have this divide, if we have people who are resistant to scientific theory, if and when it conflicts with what they regard as religious truth, one instinct would be, just as Jim Krupa is saying, teach them the facts. Is that always the best method?
Well, actually, when I read James' article in Orion, I was very impressed with, first of all, I agree that you need to teach evolution throughout the biology course. It's not something you should be leaving to one section. I don't think that's doing it justice. But I also noted, James, that you talked about how what you first do is introduce your students to the nature of science. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. Too many students, too many folks in this country simply don't understand what science is.
So I think that's an excellent place to begin. Then you go into the theory of evolution, and my understanding is you end up with examples of how evolutionary medicine is significant, which really brings it home for the student. The only place where I kind of scratched my head and thought, I might do that differently, is the fact that you leave that discussion to the end of your course on a lecture on social resistance to evolution. And you say you do it because you know there are students in your class who are convinced that evolution is a threat to their religious beliefs. And you also note that this particular lesson provokes the most discussion after class. So my one suggestion would be, or question to you, is why not start your class with that discussion? Why not start your class with an acknowledgement of this cultural controversy?
Well, that's a good question. And I've moved that lecture all about over the years. I've had it in the middle. I've had it in various places. I can't really answer you. I don't know what would be best. In some ways, some of the comments have been, if I put it up first, then I'm really coming across as not teaching a science class. And so I try things at different times, but it seemed like by doing it at the end of the semester, I've now laid out all the evidence. And maybe that it's best to give them all the evidence, then talk about the problem. But, you're right. Where is the best place? Maybe it is at the beginning. I've tried it everywhere but the beginning so far.
And could I just add one more thing to that? Now, you're teaching at a college level. Most of my work around this area is actually thinking about high school. And there is research by science educators that actually maybe we do, especially in communities where we know this is an issue, that the students can't even begin to be in a place where they can take in an understanding of science and hear what you're saying to them, unless you first acknowledge for them that you understand this is a difficult subject. Now, you're dealing with a large, how many hundreds of students at a time in a large introductory college biology course, whereas this is in reference to working with high school students. But that would be the only thing I would suggest is I think you might do better to actually acknowledge it at the beginning of the class. Create a space where maybe students can calm down a bit and just hear what you have to say.
I want to get Bob McCauley to this conversation too. Maybe we can talk about why is this hard to believe? In other words, if we have this problem in this country or this phenomenon in this country with 50% of the population at least having some resistance to evolution as fact, why would that be hard for people to accept?
Well, I'm interested in the cognitive foundations of science and religion, and it seems to me that the cognitive evidence about how human minds work suggests that we find the radically counterintuitive representations that science advances very, very hard to accept, to even understand. This is true in biology, but it's true across the sciences. In the biological case in particular, I suppose two prominent sort of features of human mental life stick out and constitute pretty important barriers for people to understand Darwinian evolution. The first is the presumption that species have essences. This is, as it were, sort of one of the foundational assumptions of what we might call folk biology. And of course, finally, the point about Darwin's theory is that that just isn't true. But it's a tough intuition for people to shake. It's a tough intuition even for scientists to shake.
I want to just pause you there and make sure that I, and therefore maybe the rest of the audience, understands what we're saying. So in other words, species have essences, that there's such a thing as an antelope, and it's immutably an antelope. It's not something that's in the process of becoming something else or that evolved from a previous thing, that there is, at almost a platonic level, something called an antelope.
Exactly, and the contrast is with thinking about the ability to think about populations. That particular antelope isn't, in fact, becoming anything else. But to say that the population of antelopes in question at any particular time isn't undergoing change is a different kind of claim. And of course, across that population and across the gene pool that's relevant here, there are mutations arising in that population all the time, and there are any number of other circumstances that can end up isolating populations that have reproductive consequences and long-term reproductive consequences.
So you said there were two levels of resistance. One of them is this notion of essence. Is there? What's the other one?
Yeah, the second one is our sort of penchant for teleological reasoning. Deborah Kellerman at Boston University, a developmental psychologist, has just done terrific research on this, showing that little children operate with teleological presumptions about the world. One of her wonderful papers entitled "Why Are Rocks Pointy?" She asks kids about this, and the kids give either the answer that the rock's pointy so that animals won't sit on it, or the rock's pointy so that animals can scratch themselves on it, one or the other of those answers. But the point is that we see, as it were, agency all around. It's our sort of most fundamental medium for explanatory accounts and designing agents with purposes, agents with goals, agents with intentions. What is in some ways most remarkable about Kellerman's research is she also shows that this is a penchant of adult thinking as well, and not just adult thinking, but even under certain circumstances of cognitive stress, something that PhD-level scientists will manifest. The way experimental psychologists put people under cognitive stress is, for example, to have them have to solve a problem, say, every 2 seconds. So in this case, her design is one where she simply offers a bunch of sentences that are explanatory accounts about certain phenomena in the world, and people have to just in 2 seconds quickly decide true or false. And what you find is that a whole population of PhD level physical scientists that she did these tests with manifested exactly the same kind of teleological penchants that the normal population does.
So teleological meaning that something is in its end state. It's the way it is for a reason.
It's the way it is for a reason. It's the way it is because it has a purpose. That it was. There are a host of sort of concepts surrounding this notion, but likewise that it may well be something that is designed with a purpose in mind by an agent who has intentional states and representations. Okay, I want to just switch back to Jim Krupa for a second here, and to Connie too. Bob McCauley said, "Well, evolution's counterintuitive." Do you agree with that? I mean, I sort of feel like as a student, when somebody started explaining evolution to me, I thought, well, that sort of makes intuitive sense that it would have worked out that way.
Well, it's funny. I guess I think differently. That it became clear and obvious to me when I was in fourth grade. So I've never really had that problem, and I was connected to nature, and I was in nature from the day I was born. So I think in some ways, like Darwin and Wallace and Huxley and all these folks, they were exposed to nature to where there were questions about nature, and the answers were evolutionary. So for me, it's not been an issue, and so I can't address how other people view it in different ways.
I mean, Connie, it seems like we're talking about two different things in some ways. In some ways, we're talking about the sheer difficulty of wrapping your mind around scientific concepts, sometimes when our natural instinct, as Bob is suggesting, is to go to a slightly more simple, well, it's just supposed to be that way of thinking. And then there's the other question of the just existence of religious doctrine, which in many cases militates against what's taught in science class. And is one of these more important than the other, or do they, as far as you're concerned, amount to the same thing?
Well, let me begin by addressing what Robert's speaking about, and I find it interesting that wasn't James' experience of evolution himself as being something that's counterintuitive. It certainly wasn't mine either, but I would also say that when I look at Bob's work, the opposite comes to mind to me. I think kids are born scientific. I think they're born questioning and thinking about things and testing things. My own background is in experimental petrology, so actually designing experiments to test ideas is how I tend to think about science. And watch kids at play, watch toddlers. This is what they're doing. Maybe when they get to school, unfortunately, they get a different experience with science, and instead of becoming a process, it becomes an exercise in facts, and maybe they even lose interest in it. But so just to put that aside, I have a problem with thinking about evolution and crediting it with something that makes us a certain way or predisposes us a certain way. When I look at evolution, especially in terms of our own species, I see a process that helped us survive by altering our environments and our behaviors, and that's an ongoing process, and it is as just as conducive to scientific thought as it is to religious thought. So that's the first part. In terms of religious doctrine, I think there's another piece that we're not speaking about. And of course, we all recognize that there's many, even in terms of Christianity, which is probably where James experiences most of the pushback with his students, just given the demographic that he's in. But we know that there's a range in Christian beliefs, and that not all Christians are anti-evolutionists. There's different Christian doctrines. But what I really see happening in James's class, and I know other researchers are looking at this, is it's so much that you're presenting them with facts that go against their religious doctrine, and so because of that, they're shutting down? Or does it have more to do with the fact that in accepting these facts, you're asking them to walk away from a community that's been their source of support? This is what the beliefs that they grew up with. And setting those aside for, to accept the evidence has got to be a pretty long and difficult process. And James, you mentioned at the end of your article about a student you watched struggle with this.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is why I really look at this as it's very important that we figure out the best way to present the science content. Of course we need to do that, and weaving evolution throughout the course. But again, I come back to acknowledging where the students we're dealing with are, and how can we make the environment a safe place for them to take in this evidence. And do I expect when they leave your course it's going to change their mind? No. But you certainly have in your own experience examples of students where down the line this has happened. They've changed their view on something.
All right, Jim, you had something to say, and then I want to get back to Bob about something. But go ahead, Jim.
Well, there are a couple of things. So when I was teaching non-majors, now I'm teaching the evolution course. I'm doing more evolution. But I would step out of the non-majors general biology class with evolution upsetting people into the human ecology class that followed. And there it was climate change, global warming, which doesn't have a religious connection, but it has just as strong a reaction. And I think it's fascinating that we can talk about the conflict with religion. Clearly with evolution, that's important. But then to understand that, we also have to understand why there's the resistance to the evidence for climate change or the importance of vaccinations. It gets even more complex. But one of the other things I wanted to say earlier, that after that essay was published, I had somewhere around 280 emails. And one student, a young college student, said that her family is very conservative Baptist Christian, and she's always been very fascinated by evolution. And as a result, she has become an outcast in her own family because they don't like her views, and that she posted my essay on her website. And immediately, 40% of her friends unfriended her because of that. And it hurts to think that there are folks like that are trying to understand things, and they, as you said, they have their community that's pulling away from them or pushing them away, and that's a very tough thing for them to deal with.
I want to go back to Bob for a second here because I don't want to gloss over something that he said that I think is important. And I can sense that Jim and Connie may be in a slightly different place. But, Bob, some of your argument really is that there is a hardwired quality in humans that makes them want to believe certain things. John Calvin called it sensus divinitatis. He said there exists in the human mind and indeed by natural instinct some sense of deity we hold to be beyond dispute. Of course, Calvin thought that the reason we had some sense of deity is because God put it in us just to make sure that we knew he was there. But what you're saying is that before human children begin to think scientifically, they think somewhat magically. They have a kind of a theory of mind about their whole environment that leans more towards religion than it does to hard science.
Well, I would be hesitant about using the language of hardwired, but
okay.
I do hold the view that, and have argued for the view that a variety of penchants of human minds, and it seems to me it's unequivocally the case that evolution has structured us to have minds of a certain sort. We have loads of evidence for that. For example, one not just in our species, but in other species. I mean, one trial learning findings about things like fear of snakes. Does that mean everyone's frightened of snakes? Does that mean everyone finds evolution radically counterintuitive? No, but across populations, this is the overwhelming finding. Yeah, you're quite right. A number of religiously inclined thinkers have really been happy to leap on the work that I and others have done in the cognitive science of religion to argue that indeed it as it were, provides an account of exactly what Calvin was pointing to. But the suggestion is that, in fact, we have these various penchants of mind, I think designed largely by evolution, but I think there's a good deal of variability in sort of what forms they take and how they get tuned by culture. But they are not directly about religion. They're, in fact, not at all about religion. They're typically about a host of other things, from hazards in our environment to social understanding of other minds and, indeed, theory of mind. But these are just the sorts of penchants of mine that religions quite routinely engage. And, one might say exploit. I think that religions evolve to exploit these things. A host of predilections. Theory of mind's the most prominent. Scientists write analytical articles in very, very rigorous forms, assembling evidence and using mathematical accounts of findings and assessment of evidence and so on. But religions quite routinely rely on narratives, myths and stories. Those are things that human minds find really easy to understand. I'm afraid that most of the accomplishments of science are things that folks find generally hard to understand.
We should just say by way of clarity, so theory of mind is sort of the notion that we can understand the states of other beings around us, so that I can sit here and say, well, Bob's angry now and Connie's thinking about this and Jim, Jim would be reacting to this in such a way, and that we can expand that and say, well, thunder is because God's angry and the golf ball didn't go in the hole because the golf ball hates me, and that's sort of how we sort of animate the environment in a way that you're suggesting, I think.
Yeah, and the history of modern science is a history of basically a progressive restriction on the domains where we any longer take such explanations seriously. You're quite right. In the ancient world, meteorology, the oceans, mountains and so on were regarded as agents. But over time, our science has advanced and improved, and sort of agent explanations are just not any longer considered part of the picture.
All right, we're going to have to I'm going to have to interrupt. We're going to have to jump into a break right now. When we come back, we'll have more of Jim and Connie and Bob. We'll take your calls, too, at 860-275-7266. We're here live in the afternoon. Hi, we're talking about science and religion. We've been talking a lot about evolution, although we're not going to confine ourselves to that. We will talk about how this plays out in considerations of climate change and considerations of vaccination, and maybe in some other areas that are a little less obvious and maybe a little less ascribable to the interference of religion. I'm thinking about the fact that there's an incredible divide between the number of scientists who believe that genetically modified foods pose no danger to you and just the average person. It's, let's see, 88% of scientists from the American Association for the Advancement of Science are cool with eating genetically modified foods. Only 37% of the general population feels that way. So it's not always just the religious people versus the scientists. Anyway, before we get back to our guests, or maybe in conjunction with our conversation with our guest, let me just think about how I'm going to do this. I'm going to take a phone call from Alex in Hartford. I also want to say you can tweet us at WNPR. Colin, our tweet master, Greg Hill, is there. Hi, Alex. You're on the line.
Hi. I just wanted to comment, since I grew up in Kentucky and was a biology major there and had lots and lots of conversations about evolution. Basically, anytime someone found out that I was a biology major, they would confront me on that topic. And what I found was that, evolution doesn't have to be complicated for people to deny it. And I think you're getting to that with the climate change and GMO talk. But even very simple facts that don't revolve around theories were difficult to talk about. So if I discussed, like, Noah's Ark being, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, I would just be denied. Some creationists would tell me that, I was just wrong, and I tried to show them the book or lead them to the internet, and I would just be told, no, you're wrong. And that was the end of the conversation. So I think there's a lot to the idea that evolution, for whatever reason, conflicts with foundational beliefs of Christianity. And that's how people perceive it. And so that's, I think, where a lot of this comes from. It doesn't have to be complicated.
All right, so he makes a really interesting point, Jim Krupa, although I think that there's sort of two things in that point. One of them is he's saying, well, look, no, if you get this set of beliefs, if you embrace it, and as Connie is suggesting also, if your community, if the people that you rely on for support are the people who also embrace it, then you're going to have an easier time rejecting something like evolution. Whether or not it's counterintuitive, whether or not it's complicated to understand, you're going to be able to reject it. I also feel feel like we're in a period of time, almost kind of post-Enlightenment moment, where people feel very comfortable just rejecting facts anyway. You can give them a fact, and I don't know, maybe it's the constant reinterpretation of reality by cable news and the internet and stuff like that. But people feel very comfortable just saying, as he's suggesting, well, I don't really care that the story of Noah is also in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Who cares? That's just your opinion, man.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there are all too many folks like that, and I understand I won't be able to reach all of them. But yeah, if one of the reasons why I do teach evolutionary medicine is that this attitude, well, it doesn't matter to me, it's not important to me, my world says it's not important, then I like to counter by saying, well, if you don't understand natural selection, it could kill you. And that seems extreme, but that's why I think if we're going to get people to understand and appreciate evolution, to show that it does influence their lives, and evolutionary medicine is the example. So I think that's the best thing that we can do, is show how evolution is actually significant in their lives. And maybe we'll gain a few folks, but if I can win over or open the minds of a couple individuals each semester, I'll consider the semester a success. But being a teacher, it's frustrating because, excuse me, no matter how hard I try, there are students that won't like me. No matter how hard I try, there are students that will simply reject what I'm teaching, and that's part of the business.
Connie Burtka, does this dualism have to exist, at least as toxically as it seems to sometimes, this divide between religion and science? I mean, some of the earliest scientists were religious people, and people like Locke, who introduced empiricism, did so from a pretty Christian or Unitarian perspective. And even now you see things like the Evangelical Climate Initiative, which Rick Warren and 86 other pastors started sort of saying, oh no, climate science is very consistent with our role as evangelical pastors, and we ought to be doing something about carbon emissions. I mean, it seems to me that this, I don't know who manufactured this divide, but I don't think it has to exist all the time.
Well, it's certainly true. If you talk to historians of religion and science, and there have been many books written on that, they will point out immediately that assuming the relationship between science and religion has always been one of conflict is greatly oversimplified. Not the least of which you have to identify which religion are you talking about, which science are you talking about, and when. So that's the short answer to the history. But obviously there's other ways that people can relate science and religion besides conflict. One way that's probably just as common is to just separate the two and say they have nothing to do with one another. So science talks about how, religion talks about why. They can't be in conflict because they answer very different kind of questions. And this is often an understanding. Actually, scientists want students to understand about the difference between science and religion. And as I had one of my students point out to me in my science and religion course that I teach for seminarians, that's probably a good place to start. When you think about these things, you need to start by understanding the differences between science and religion as well as the similarities. But what's much more interesting to me, and is certainly true for many science and religion scholars, is to look at how these two might actually interact with one another. And it's also true that we tend to have an image of religion as something very stagnant that never changes, and that's just not true. Religious understandings do change. There's many theologians who are looking at what science is learning about the world and taking it into account in their understandings of God. There's theologians who embrace doing that. Now, the breakdown, I would say, is in some of that work and how much of it actually reaches the pew. And this, I would say, is something that needs to change about seminary education. Understanding how science and religion might interact beyond contrast and conflict needs to be a bigger subject in seminary education. And this is why, we'll often hear, Roman Catholics have no issue with evolution, yet you poll Roman Catholics on it and you find out that 1/3 of the people sitting in the pew can't accept evolution. And many of them think that their official church doctrine is not to accept evolution. So there's a real breakdown, actually, between what's being done on a scholarly level and what actually is reaching down into religious education. But I also had one colleague of mine remind me, think about a time when you've had an opportunity to, say, teach a course in introductory geology. Would you want all of geology to be judged by what your students left the room understanding? So the work, the scholarly work that theologians do, and getting that work translated into a broader public understanding is just as challenging for them as it is for scientists.
Bob, I think it's also tempting when you look at what science is, and particularly in the way that it's consumed by the general public. You can sort of understand some people's skepticism about science, this kind of sense that an idea like the Higgs boson particle, we're talking about counterintuitive, and there are even scientists who were at one point legitimate physicists writing papers about maybe the Higgs boson particle didn't want to be found, maybe it had some kind of interest in not being located. Even the Big Bang, is a pretty exotic concept. And you take that and you compound it with the fact that if you read the New York Times science section every week, you're going to have the sensation every 6 months or so of having the last article you read about a particular subject utterly contravened by the latest round of research, that now it turns out that something that was bad for you is good for you, that something that was thought to exist in a certain state exists in the absolute opposite state. The constant sense of revision of science may make some people think, well, maybe it is kind of a matter of hermeneutics. Maybe it's all just how you interpret data as opposed to empirical, unbudgeable fact.
I think that you're quite right in your characterization of science and the fact that it's always undergoing change. One of the problems of science education is that, especially at the early levels, science is presented to students as if it's settled truth, when in fact it's simply sort of the best theories that we've got today, given the current state of the evidence, but that the current state of the evidence is always undergoing change because more scientists are finding more and new and cleverer ways to test theories and to bring hypotheses to empirical account. This is a disconcerting feature for lots of folks with regard to science, and that is just precisely that the verdict can change and can sometimes change 180 degrees. I wrote a blog about eggs were good for us, then they were bad for us, then they were good for us. But those kinds of things are happening in science all the time. That's why I think that actually the way James's course is organized is good. I think that teaching folks about the character of science up front, and even more specifically just about the character of evidence, what counts as evidence, how do you discern evidence, how do you collect evidence, how do you record evidence, how do you generate new evidence, and then the parts that I don't think kids are at all capable of doing is how do you analyze and assess evidence, and those are the rarefied skills that take a lot of education to acquire and to appreciate.
All right, we're going to grab a quick break here. We've got one more segment with these three wonderful guests. We'll be back with Jim and Bob and Connie after this.
Okay, if science is real and magic is fake, how come Pluto used to be a planet and then got turned into Mickey Mouse's dog? Yeah, I thought so. Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolf. Our intern is Sydney Lauro. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. The part of Bill Curry was played by Sarah Palin. For show pages, articles, and videos of the Faith Middleton Show staff trying slow cooker unicorn recipes, visit our website, WNPR.org/Colin. On tomorrow's show, why can you visit the houses of some great writers, but not others? And now, back to Colin.
Although the Faith Middleton Show staff does not endorse the eating of genetically modified unicorns. All right, so we're talking about sort of not just the clash between religion and science, but the clash between people's individual beliefs and maybe what is scientific understanding of reality. So, and with us is Dr. Robert McCauley, professor of philosophy, director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture at Emory University, the author of Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. Connie Burtka, visiting professor at Wesley Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Human Origins Initiative for the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. James Krupa, professor of biology at the University of Kentucky. His essay, Defending Darwin, in the March-April issue of Orion magazine, is kind of what got us started on all this. So, Jim Krupa, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to hear from all of our people about this. So it's not just the clash between a religious person who might be a creationist or at least not a believer in evolution and a scientist who is. This kind of thing goes on all over the place. I mean, we've talked about climate change. We can talk about genetically modified food. Scientists basically pretty comfortable with it. The average person not at all comfortable with it. And I don't really know where anti-vaxxers come from, but I don't think they exclusively come from a religious community. I mean, anecdotally, they seem as likely to be authority rejecting alternative lifestyle people as anything else. And the other thing that we know is that when somebody believes something, it's very, very difficult to dislodge that belief. And firing facts and studies and information about them doesn't necessarily turn things around, right?
Yep. Well, I always like to give students examples of my flaws, and so I point out that this bird that I'm very fascinated by, the ivory-billed woodpecker, all evidence indicates that it's extinct, but I want to believe it's still out there. I have no evidence for that. I just want to believe it's there. So, belief is sometimes, it's comforting, or it's simple, or something. So, when we're giving folks tough subjects to digest, it's hard to deal with.
Connie, it seems as though, I mean, we've sort of talked a little bit about this already, but it seems as though the more that we emphasize the divide between one set of ideas and another, the worse off we are. And we live in a world really, I mean, I talked about the Evangelical Climate Initiative. Pope Francis said the Big Bang, which is today posited as the origin of the world, does not contradict the divine act of creation. Rather, it requires it. Similarly, he said evolution of nature is not inconsistent with the notion of creation because evolution presupposes the creation of beings which evolve. It seems as though we don't really celebrate the degree to which there's a lot of common ground. Maybe we're just a lot more intrigued by things we can argue about.
That's exactly right. Conflict sells, doesn't it? I mean, there's something about it's more interesting than celebrating the places where we agree. And the climate change one is very interesting in terms of religions, because you're probably well aware that there's many religions coming together now suggesting that we need to address this because it is a moral and religious imperative for us. So they're actually accepting the science because and paying attention to it because they believe morally they need to do that. But there's another piece of the climate change issue that I'm familiar with that speaks to this as well. It may not, for those folks who deny climate change, it may not necessarily be tied to a particular religious belief, but it does seem to be tied to other communities of belonging. In that case, political communities of belonging become the important community. So when we think about getting past these divides, in my own mind, I keep thinking it's going to have to come down to new relationships. We're going to have to figure out a way to communicate and trust and speak with people that we don't normally deal with, right? And there has to be some level of trust built there to even start to entertain these ideas that aren't usually the ideas we hear about.
I think that's a great point and a great argument for trust between two different sides. Because, Bob McCauley, there's a certain number of people who will listen to this and say, well, no, it's simply a matter of getting the facts into the hands of these people who don't have the facts. But what we know from the research of Daniel Kahan at Yale, Brendan Nyan at Dartmouth, they've done studies about what happens when you present somebody who believes X with concrete evidence of Y. And it doesn't seem to affect this huge, antelope herd-like migration of people over to the set of beliefs that are confirmed by a set of facts. Sometimes it actually deepens the problem, right?
I can't say whether or not it deepens the problem, but I think that the findings are well corroborated. That is to say that appreciating evidence and the sophisticated forms that science typically advances it is a very difficult cognitive accomplishment. You're quite right. I mean, most of the research in terms of looking at how people manage the evidence when it's placed before them is that, human beings tend to show pervasive confirmation bias. That is to say, what we tend to do is sort of cherry pick the evidence that tends to confirm or support the view that people came into the debate with in the first place. This is a finding, actually, that's even been shown with scientists themselves, and that's why you can't rely on the rationality of individual scientists. What you have to rely on is the very special set of social arrangements that science constitutes, where, in effect, scientists are always checking one another, always testing each other's theories. We may not be so great at sort of conceding or recognizing the problems with our own accounts, but we're pretty good at finding problems with other people's accounts. This is what is known as the IKEA effect. That is to say, folks who have IKEA furniture tend to, it turns out, overrate the value of that furniture. Well, why? It's because they made it.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, the point that I like is that the weakness of human nature is really the strength of science. And so we have to know that scientists are humans and humans are flawed. So that is why we need to do alternative studies, additional studies, to make sure that science continues to be self-checking. So it's ironic that our flaws are what make science stronger.
I go further than that and say that, one of the other ironies to me is that a diverse climate of thought is a great thing in a lot of ways. And if you think about what the Enlightenment really was, the overthrowing of this sense that the divine right of kings and this whole kind of hierarchical ordering of the world, the Enlightenment sort of said, well, no, you can question all that stuff. You have the capacity to question it. A lot of it might not be true, and you can actually figure out whether it's true or not. You, the average person sitting in a coffee shop in London, you can figure out whether this is true or not. But we've sort of moved to a point where, people watch Fox News and it says one thing, and then they watch MSNBC and it says the opposite thing. And it seems as though, Jim, our access to a multiplicity of opinions means that people will sort of say, as I was suggesting before, that anything is a matter of interpretation.
Yeah, that's true.
So how do we deal with that? You have a minute to solve this problem. You started it.
If I could solve it in a minute, I would be very, very happy. The fact that we haven't been able to solve this, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of disagreement, that we really don't have the answer just yet is disturbing. Better education earlier on, science education, is certainly one of the keys. But yeah, I wish I had the answer for you.
All right. Well, we don't necessarily traffic in answers. We're public radio. I'm gonna end then. As people who listen to the show know, I'm kind of obsessed with Sir Tom Stoppard, and so in Jumpers, his character George says that there is presumably a calendar date, a moment when the onus of proof passed from the atheist to the believer, when quite suddenly, secretly, the no's had it. So that's Stoppard sort of saying, well, we did this transition over to this hyper-rationalist society where, at least within the world of academia, the no's, the people who didn't believe in God, had it. But then he says, but we keep coming back to it, almost as part of God's divine indestructibility. We never get away from that question. He says the question will not go away. Is God? So it tends to sort of shore up Bob Macaulay's point. I mean, maybe that's just sort of a little bit of who we are. All right, thanks very much, especially to Betsy Kaplan, who made this whole show happen. Gene Amatruda, who solved a huge technical problem for us right before showtime. Wolfie, who kept us on track. We'll be back tomorrow.
If we evolved from apes, then did apes evolve from humans? And does that mean we're going to evolve back into apes? I remain unconvinced, but were apes ever convinced that they were once humans? Wait, can apes even be convinced of anything? Is a capacity to be convinced an evolved expansion of intelligence, which means... Oh, sweet, Seinfeld is on.